If you're watching this, chances are you want to start painting miniatures, but you're not quite sure where to begin. Maybe you've never painted before, or maybe you've watched a few tutorials and felt overwhelmed. Either way, that's completely normal. So in this video, I'll walk you through how to start miniature painting, from preparing your first model, to choosing the right tools, and finally putting paint on the miniature in a way that actually makes sense. No complicated techniques and no expensive gear. Just the fundamentals you really need so you can enjoy the process and keep improving from there. Plastic miniatures such as Warhammer models usually come attached to a sprue. These can be made up of many individual pieces. To remove the parts from the sprue, you will need a pair of clippers. These can be proper hobby clippers, but honestly even odd wire cutting clippers will work just fine. When I started out, I used a rusty old pair I already had at home, and I continue using them till this day. Once the parts are removed, you may notice small bits of leftover plastic where the piece was attached to the sprue. This is where a hobby knife becomes useful. You can carefully scrape or cut this away. And if you don't have a hobby knife, a simple box cutter can work just as fine. As you'll see throughout this video, there are always budget alternatives to expensive hobby products. And while proper tools are certainly better and more comfortable to use, they are absolutely not required when you're just starting out and want to see if the hobby is for you. Finally, you may notice mold lines, thin lines of excess plastic left over from the molding process. These can be scraped away with your knife or smoothed out using a hobby file or sanding stick. Now at this point you might be wondering, do I really need to do all this cleanup? Can't I just paint over it and forget about it? Well, technically you could, but here's the problem. Many beginner-friendly painting techniques actually emphasize imperfections, making mold lines and leftover bits of plastic stand out much more once paint is applied. So while these flaws might not be very visible now, they will become much more noticeable later, and taking a bit of time during preparation really pays off in the end. That said, preparation is also a surprisingly relaxing part of the hobby, and something I've grown to enjoy as a part of the process. But what about 3D printed miniatures? Do they require as much preparation? Well, in short, yes, but in a slightly different way. Printed models may come as a single piece or broken into parts just like plastic kits. The biggest difference is the presence of supports, which are necessary for the printing process. These supports can usually be removed by hand or with clippers. But if you buy 3D printed models from a store or a seller, the supports will often be removed already. Yet you may still find small leftover marks. And just like with plastic models, these can be cleaned up using a knife or a file to achieve a smoother finish. Now what about gluing the model together if it comes in multiple pieces? Well, for this there are two main options you'll encounter: superglue and plastic glue. Superglue works on pretty much everything. It will bond plastic, resin, metal, anything you throw at it. The downside is that it can be a bit brittle. If your models are handled roughly, dropped or transported loosely, pieces may snap off and need to be glued again later. Plastic glue, on the other hand, only works on plastic models. But instead of acting like traditional glue, it actually melts the plastic slightly, fusing the two pieces together into a single solid part once it dries. This creates a much stronger bond, but again, it only works on plastic. So if you are getting into something like Warhammer where the kits are plastic, then plastic glue is definitely the way to go, and will save you some headaches down the line. If not, superglue will never fail in doing its job. Now that our model is fully cleaned and glued together, it is finally time to paint, right? Well, not quite. Paint doesn't naturally like sticking to bare plastic or resin, and if we paint straight onto the model, the paint can rub off or behave inconsistently. To solve this, we want to begin with a primer. Just like when painting a wall, that first layer creates a surface that the following layers can properly adhere to. When it comes to priming, you have a few options. A very common choice is using rattle can primers. These can be hobby branded primers or off-brand spray primers. If you go this route, it is worth doing a bit of research to make sure the product you are using actually works well on miniatures, as not all spray paints behave the same way. If you want to avoid the fumes, don't have consistent good weather conditions, or simply want more control, there are also brush-on primers that can be applied directly with a brush. However, when I was starting out, and even for my first few years in the hobby, I simply used black craft acrylic paint as a primer. It wasn't as fast as spray cans and not as durable as proper primer, but once thin slighted with water, it created a perfectly usable surface for my paints to stick to. But no matter which method you use, one thing is very important when priming, and that is not to flood the details. It is very easy to focus on a hard-to-reach area, add too much paint, and end up drowning nearby details under a thick layer of paint. Once that happens, those details are gone for good. Another thing to keep in mind is the color of the primer. You see, acrylic paints are naturally transparent, meaning whatever color sits underneath them will influence how they look, as well as how many layers it takes to reach full coverage. Because of this, a white primer is often the best choice if you want bright, vibrant colors and fast coverage. A black primer, on the other hand, is much more forgiving, as any areas you can't easily reach with your brush will stay black, and those dark spots naturally read as shadows. With a white primer, any missed areas such as these will tend to stand out and look unfinished. But this is where zenithal priming comes in. It combines the benefits of both approaches by first priming the model black and then spraying white from above. This leaves the recesses dark while highlighting the upward-facing surfaces, which are naturally the areas that would catch most light. But zenithal priming not only helps with lights and shadows, it also makes the sculpt easier to read, helping you see where to place the colors later on. That said, I'll repeat this again. For my first years in the hobby, a single coat of black craft acrylic paint worked just fine as a primer. With our model now properly prepared to receive paint, it is time to talk about the essential tools you'll need to actually begin painting: brushes, paints, and a palette. Up to this point, I've told you not to feel pressured into buying expensive hobby products if you're just testing the waters. However, this is the area where better tools can really make a difference, and even help you in enjoying the hobby more. Let us start with brushes. There are two main types of brushes you need to be aware of: natural hair brushes and synthetic brushes. Natural hair brushes are made from animal hair and are considered ideal for miniature painting. They hold a sharp point much better than synthetic brushes, which makes working on small details much easier. They are also softer and smoother to use. The downside is the price. A single natural hair brush can cost as much as an entire set of synthetic brushes. Because of that, I strongly recommend starting out with synthetic brushes. There are plenty of affordable options available, and while the fine tips won't last forever, often only 4 or 5 models, they are perfect for learning brush control, getting comfortable painting, and trying techniques that are rougher on the brushes. Later on, once you're more confident, you can invest in a single, good quality natural hair brush for detailed work. Just keep in mind that for that brush to last, it will require proper care and cleanup. When it comes to paints, hobby paints aren't expensive without a reason. They are more heavily pigmented and have a smoother, more consistent texture than regular craft paints, which makes them easier and more enjoyable to work with. If you compare them side by side, you'll notice that craft paints often need to be wrestled into behaving the way you want. That said, I personally started out this hobby using craft paints, simply because hobby paints were too expensive for me at the time. Depending on where you live, shipping and taxes can easily double the price of hobby paints. But that didn't stop me from falling in love with the hobby and slowly building my collection one color at a time. If you can afford them, I recommend Vallejo paints, as they offer a great balance between quality and price. As for how many paints you need, that depends entirely on what you plan to paint. If you are painting armies like Warhammer, you'll often repeat the same color scheme across many models. That means you don't need every color under the sun, just the ones relevant to your faction. A friend of mine recently started Warhammer, and covered his entire army needs with fewer than 10 paints. If on the other hand you plan to paint a wide variety of models like in Dungeons & Dragons, an introductory paint set is a great option. You might not use every color right away, but you will cover any of your needs, plus you can cover even more ground with basic color mixing. For those wondering how I started, my very first paints were black, white, purple, orange and green. That choice came from a Marco Frisioni video where he teaches an exercise focused on color mixing using secondary colors. After that, I picked up primary colors and gradually expanded my collection based on the projects I was working on. Finally, let's talk about the palette. I cannot stress this enough. A wet palette makes a massive difference, especially for beginners. When I started out, I used an aluminum palette. It was easy to clean, but my paints dried out in just a few minutes, which was incredibly frustrating when I needed to take my time learning. Whether you buy a proper wet palette or make one yourself using a container, paper towel and baking paper, this is probably the tool that will make the most difference. It will keep your paints moist and workable for much longer and also give you a space to mix colors easily, something paint pots simply don't allow. Now that we've gone over how to prepare the miniature and the basic tools you need to paint, it is finally time to actually put paint on the model. We are going to look at the painting process in its most simple and generic form. This is a framework you'll be able to apply to almost any miniature you paint. That said, keep in mind that some models can be painted in more efficient or specialized ways. As you go deeper down the rabbit hole of techniques, you'll start to recognize when certain approaches can give you faster, cleaner or more interesting results. But for now, this foundation will serve you extremely well. So let's begin with base coating. Base coating simply means filling in each part of the model with its corresponding color, doing your best to stay within the lines. Think of this step like painting a coloring book. But unlike a flat drawing, miniatures are three-dimensional objects. They have raised details, recesses and complex shapes. And because of that, proper paint dilution becomes extremely important. A very common rule in miniature painting, popularized by Duncan Rhodes and now considered almost universal advice, is to apply 2 thin coats of paint instead of 1 thick one. This is done by mixing a small amount of water into your paint, just enough to make it slightly more fluid, and there are several benefits to this. First, acrylic paints are naturally transparent. Applying 2 or sometimes 3 thin coats allows the color to reach its full richness without becoming thick or chalky. Second, thinner paint flows more easily around raised details and into recesses, helping preserve all the sculpted texture instead of burying it. What we want is paint that's fluid enough to move smoothly but not so watery that it runs uncontrollably into areas we're not trying to paint. At the same time, we want to avoid using paint straight out of the pot. While thick paint may give stronger coverage in one pass, it tends to pull in the recesses, creating clumps and ultimately erasing fine detail. Once your miniature is fully base coated, again in that coloring book style, you'll probably notice that something still feels off. And that's because at this stage your model has no sense of light or shadow. It's a three-dimensional object but painted in flat colors. So the next step is to introduce shadows. For beginners, there are 2 very approachable ways to do this. The first option is using washes. A wash is essentially very diluted paint designed to flow into the recesses of a model. It darkens those areas while leaving the raised surfaces mostly untouched, creating instant contrast between shadows and midtones. While you can technically make a wash by heavily diluting your own paint with water, pre-made washes from hobby brands are specifically formulated for this purpose. The mediums in them help the paint settle properly into recesses and dry smoothly. Plain water-diluted paint can sometimes dry unevenly and create what are known as coffee stains, especially if you're not careful. Because of how effective they are, washes are often considered the magic sauce of beginner painters. They can make a model look noticeably better with very little effort. And even though I personally rarely use a wash these days, I would still recommend any beginner painter to pick up at least a black or a brown wash to start with. However, washes do have a weakness. They work incredibly well on heavily textured areas like fur, chainmail, leather or organic surfaces, but on large flat panels they tend to struggle. Since there are no recesses for the wash to settle into, gravity takes over, and the wash often dries in blotches or stains, leaving uneven marks across the surface. So what do we do if the model isn't very textured? Well, this brings us to the second beginner-friendly approach to shading, and that is layering. Layering refers to the process of applying multiple layers of paint, one on top of the other, with each lighter layer covering a slightly smaller area than the previous one. To do this, we usually start with a slightly darker base color, and this darker tone acts as our shadows. From there, we apply a lighter version of that color over the raised areas, leaving the darker base coat visible in the recesses and shadowed regions. In essence, you're doing the same base coating process but more selectively. And to make these transitions look smooth and avoid harsh jumps in color, you have 2 main tools at your disposal, and they can be combined. The first is simply using more layers, gradually stepping up through intermediate tones by using color mixing. The second is adding a bit more water to your paint than you would for a standard base coat, allowing each layer to blend more softly into the one beneath it. By continuing this process, you can layer all the way up to your brightest tones, creating a transition from your darkest shadows through the midtones and into the highlights. And the same idea also applies if you have used washes. Once a wash has fully dried and established darker tones in the recesses, you can go back with your base color, or even a slightly brighter version of it, and begin layering upward again. There is, however, another technique that, much like washes, can become a beginner's best friend. and that is dry brushing. Dry brushing takes advantage of surface texture to paint raised details very easily. To do this, you load paint into the brush without adding water. Then you remove most of it until only a small amount remains. From there, you just have to lightly flick or drag the brush across the surface of the model. The small amount of paint left on the brush will catch only on the most raised details, naturally creating highlights. Just like washes, dry brushes works best on textured models and is far less effective on flat surfaces. A quick side note. Many people, when using this technique, unload excess paint onto a paper towel. While this works, it often results in a dusty or chalky finish. This happens because the paper towel absorbs not only paint, but also moisture from the brush. A better alternative is to unload your brush on a flat, non-absorbent surface, like a plastic palette or tile. This preserves a bit of moisture and leads to a smoother result. I wanted to start the year with a video that goes back to the very basics, and makes getting into the hobby feel a bit less intimidating. If you're just starting out or you still consider yourself a beginner, the next few uploads will focus on the next steps. Teaching techniques, helping you improve, building confidence, and moving towards an intermediate level. If that sounds useful, make sure you're subscribed, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. This one took a bit more time than my usual uploads, so if it helped you in any way, a like or a comment really goes a long way in supporting the channel. There is still a lot more to learn, but for now, don't stress about perfection. Have fun, try things out and enjoy the process. I'll see you in the next one.